Outsiders. Good morning. Welcome to Outsiders, the show that is to woke virtue signalling and identity politics on steroids what the World Economic Forum is to discussing the great pressing problems of our time, such as the dangers of drinking a cup of coffee.
We'll be having our coffee before the session, and you raised the coffee example. I'd love just to give you the chance to expand on that.
Basically, the coffee that we all drink emits between 15 and 20 tons of CO2 per ton of coffee.
Oh my goodness, I had no idea. Oh.
So we should all know that this is every time we drink coffee, we are basically putting CO2 into the atmosphere.
Did he really say that? Heavens above. Next thing he'll be telling us that coffee is causing climate change.
One of the reasons is because most of the coffee plantation, or most of the coffee is produced through monoculture. And monoculture is also affected by climate change. The quality of these nature assets is deteriorating quite rapidly.
And now, as you sit back and savour your planet-destroying morning macchiato, let's drink to the World Economic Forum and grab the latest Outsiders news. Okay, well, lots to talk about. Rita is back from her holiday. Welcome back, Rita. Fantastic.
Straight from the airport,
Rowan.
Rowan.
Back here, straight from the airport. That's right. Well, the big news here. Now, this is big news that happened yesterday, and the reason that it's such big news is that this show, and this show alone, since 2018, has been saying that Australian taxpayers, your money was going to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, the awkwardly named UNRWA. Now, UNRWA is responsible for the education of Palestinians in Gaza and elsewhere, and your money, this is the cover of The Spectator, back in 2018, when David Adler warned that Australian tax dollars were going to fund terrorism and the murder of Jews. Everyone told us, conspiracy theory, outrageous, how dare you suggest that? Yesterday, finally, Penny Wong, and I did have a go at her last week on the show about this very topic. Penny Wong has finally suspended your tax dollars, $6 million of your tax money going to UNRWA. The reason being because the world is now sitting up and paying attention to the fact that UNRWA is being accused of funding terrorism activities, the very same accusation we've been making repeatedly on this show for many, many years. Finally, some good news, Rita.
Finally, but let's not forget that in 2022, this Labor government doubled the funding for this group, despite the fact that there were very good reasons to have doubts about where that money was going, how it was being used, was it falling into the wrong hands. They doubled the money regardless of that. Now it's been suspended. A number of other countries, including the US, have also suspended funding because there's fairly good evidence of a lot of UNRWA staff talking and celebrating the October 7 atrocity, but there's now an investigation into a number of UNRWA staff participating in this massacre.
James.
Well, look, I mean, we know that they celebrated. Back in November, I reported on this at the Daily Telegraph that many people who are teachers, officials, doctors, nurses with UNRWA, they were all on their social media saying, oh, glorious day, how wonderful the rape and murder of all these Israeli civilians couldn't come soon enough. Thank Allah for that. But there's a broader point to this. And when I went to Penny Wong's office about that, and they said they seemed quite concerned. It did seem at the time like they knew that there was a problem here. But the bigger problem, this whole idea of the UN Refugee Works Agency, the whole point of that has created 3 or 4 generations of people who still consider themselves refugees. No other people who have been displaced by any conflict consider themselves refugees 3, 4 generations on. And this fiction is the thing that winds up getting in the way of any peace between Israel and the Palestinians, because as soon as you tell the Palestinians you are perpetual victims and your children and your children and your children's children have a right to go back to wherever, the family orange grove was, rather than everybody else, basically everybody in this country at some point in their history was kicked out, of somewhere, and we don't all ask for a right of return. It is time to end this and end this whole fiction of the right of return. Well,
just take, for example, India, the partition, the division of India and Pakistan. We don't still have people desperately centuries later.
But they're refugee camps in areas controlled by the Palestinians. So we're not even talking about refugee camps as you would expect them to be. These are areas that the Palestinians have control over. So why their own people, refugees in their own areas?
And they're taking all the aid to buy Range Rovers and dig tunnels. It's ridiculous.
The whole thing is ridiculous. But like you said, it is tied. It's a political mechanism. It is the victimhood mechanism, and that's what is the currency they trade on. That's why they've got people marching in the streets of Melbourne and Sydney for them every weekend.
Well, let's talk about that because, absolutely. And let me just briefly reiterate the point. Why does the Australian government, the Labor government of Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese, why did they ignore the warnings coming from this show year in, year out? They just completely ignored it and were paying your money, your tax dollars, to UNRWA, money which we warned, which many people knew was going towards funding terrorism. Why did they ignore the voices from Australia and press on ahead? And
you know who else knew? The UN would have known or should have known. It's either incompetence or something worse, because there were all sorts of evidence and accusations and credible allegations being made, and yet what has the UN done? I mean, this is bigger than just UNRWA. This is a UN problem.
Absolutely. But also, let's not forget that Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese, the number of things they have done since taking office will show, and this is yet proof of it again, that when it comes to the crunch, Labor will always be opposed to the interests of Jews. They will always put the interests of the Palestinians before the interests of Jews every single time. They will then deny it. They will then be caught out like they have been on this, and they will then suddenly panic. Rita?
And we should not forget that Labor is in an alliance with the Greens. There's no doubting it. They would never be elected without those Greens preferences. And we know where the Greens stand on Israel. We know where the Greens stand on all these issues. They are on the extremes, and Labor is in an alliance with them. It may not be an official alliance like the Liberal National Coalition, but it is a coalition nonetheless.
Yes. Well, yeah, all of that is absolutely correct. But the bigger issue, too, is say, well, fine, it's one thing to say, Labor will not take the side of the Jews in any of these sorts of disputes. That's fine. I mean, they used to. They used to once upon a time. And there are still some members of the Labor caucus. There's still some members of the Labor caucus who are quite sensible on this still. But unfortunately, they're in the minority, because what's happened is that Labor, as you say, drawn to the left by the Greens, they have been infected with this sort of academic Marxism that equates Judaism and Israel with colonialism, with Western civilization, all of the things that they hate. Hamas is obviously, no matter what they do, is, the oppressed, so they're the victims. So whatever they do, they must have had a reason. They look at Hamas's crime and say, oh, well, if Hamas was so brutal and so terrible, they must have had a good reason. That's their logic for it. That's how twisted it is.
Oppressive narrative. I'll be talking more about that later in the show. And something else I want to highlight, which Rita just referred to, Australia Day. We saw the most disgusting and ongoing linkage of pro-Palestinian activism to pro-Indigenous activities. We saw flags, joining the flags, joining the conversations. I'll be talking about this later, but this is that same oppressor versus oppressed narrative. It's infected so many areas to the detriment of our public life. Invasion Day protests, Rita?
Yes, and it's been evident from the very first pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli protests, this linking of their cause with initially it was The Voice and now it's Anti-Australia Day treaty, and it's the same narrative that you've got this colonial power, you've got this oppressor, you've got stolen land, you've got genocide. They use the same buzzwords, always incorrectly, and it's the same narrative, and it is that neo-Marxist
and the joke is the Jews were there first, not the Palestinians, you morons. But
well,
anyway,
if anything, Israel was a decolonial project against the Ottoman Empire. But the Ottoman Empire apparently was fine. But putting that aside, one last point.
Always was, always will be Jewish.
Yeah, there you go. One of the things, too, about these Australia protests, I watched footage from them yesterday. They're out there chanting, abolish the state. They're saying things like they literally want to abolish the modern state of Australia. I don't know what alternative they have in mind. And I just think it's pretty interesting that you've got people doing that and, shutting down Parliament House with their protests yesterday, and yet, or on Friday, rather.
Sorry, I'm just interrupting. There on the screen, you are seeing constantly the linkage of pro-Palestinian with pro-Indigenous activities. Now, if I were an Indigenous leader, I would be extremely concerned about that and putting a halt to it very, very quickly.
But Rowan, why is it too, though, that, if a bunch of people dress up in balaclavas and carry the Australian flag in North Sydney, which happened on Friday, they get shut down immediately by the police, but the police have so much tolerance for this sort of protest, this sort of anti-Australian, pro-Hamas, anti-Jewish protest, which we see all the time. They talk about toughening the rules about these sorts of things, and yet we never actually see any action. And you always sort of wonder, politically, who's got the power here?
And also, what are they teaching our kids at school and in universities, even as young as kindergartens? We learned that there was one kindergarten where they were being taught that Australia was on stolen land and it didn't belong to them. So these poor little toddlers are being told that already they've been disenfranchised from their own country of birth. It is disgusting.
It is constant. The narrative is everywhere. Next, just after the ad break, I'm going to talk further about the craziness we've seen during Australia Day, particularly from some sporting organisations, and the hypocrisy there is mind-blowing. But it is everywhere. Like this morning, I landed in Sydney. It was an international flight, and I got a shock because I didn't get welcomed to my own country for once. and it was delightful, in fact.
It was finally, maybe they're listening to the people who voted 60-40 for scrapping all this nonsense. But there's another part to this, and this is really deeply disturbing. This should worry. I mean, I'm sorry to the Jewish community of Australia. You've got plenty on your plate, but this should also concern you, the news that the Mardi Gras Pride mob, a Sydney gay and lesbian Mardi Gras offshoot group, has accused Zionist Jews of being, quote, proud of genocide and the mass murder of children. So this is what you sign up to. You sign up to the militant aspects of LGBTI, what blah, 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 blahism, and you are linking with these sorts of, obviously not the entire Mardi Gras Pride mob, obviously not the entire LGBTIQ community, but there are elements within that, militant elements, who are quite happy to turn on the Jews and have done so already. Let's talk briefly about the ABC, James and Rita. They have a new chairman who's promised to bring impartiality to the ABC. Good luck with that, Kim. Can you start off, Mr. Williams? The day you walk into the Ultimo studio there, just show you a photo of the front door. We'll put this up. Mr. Williams, please, on your first day at your new place of employment. What is wrong with this picture, Rita and James? Oh, hang on. Seems to be a flag that's missing. So, Kim Williams, if you mean anything, put the Australian flag up in the headquarters at Ultimo on day one. Otherwise, your entire tenure will be a failure. Take it from here. James.
Well, I mean, the thing is, this is really, really interesting because Kim Williams used to be the chair of News Corp Australia, which, of course, is a parent company here. The stories about him are fairly legion internally about his management style. What's going to be very interesting... What's going to be very interesting...
No, don't tell James.
What's going to be fairly interesting, though, I think, is the fact that, he could go in there with all of the good intentions in the world around ending bias. But the fact is, the ABC is a staff-run collective. And you look at everybody who's ever been on the board, everybody who's tried to change the way things work at that operation, and they just... You run up against this incredible bureaucracy, and it would be amazing if what he was to do was to come in and, start slashing out so much of this huge middle management that sits as basically this great insulator to block anybody changing what's happening, with the staff who are having these tantrums now because Antoinette Lattouf got sacked from a temporary radio gig.
Rita?
I just don't understand why we're still talking about this. This is a legal matter. They are obliged to be impartial. It's in their charter. They're taxpayer funded. And you've got this ginormous organisation, over $1 billion every year. Name me, Rowan, 3 Conservative hosts.
Well, no, there aren't any. There aren't
5.
Any.
How can you, when you've got so many presenters, radio, television, online, and you've got nothing. You're basically ignoring half of the country, if not more, judging on the last referendum.
And they're doing, and their editorial decisions are absolutely bizarre. I mean, they sacked grown-ups from the Canberra Bureau, Andrew Probe and people like that. At the same time, they're going out and trying to create hip, cool videos on TikTok to get the youth audience. At the same time, they keep giving Fran Kelly slots. It doesn't make any sense what's going on there.
The coalition must, before the next election, commit, and do it properly this time, commit to putting the ABC onto a subscription model. It's what the ABC wants. They want to be like Spotify and Netflix. Good. Well, let them be put on a subscription model so that we can stop spending over $1 billion a year that could be going to much more important things.
Can I say one thing, though? At least the Albanese government hasn't put in place, I don't know, some sort of guardian wingnut into the role. Kim
Plenty
Williams,
to choose from.
Well, there's plenty to choose from. You look at the opportunity the coalition had, consecutive terms, they did nothing about that ABC bias. If anything, they emboldened them further. And they appointed Ita Buttrose, who went into that role saying they don't have a bias problem. That was a coalition government. So when they complain about the ABC, just remind them about how gutless they've been in actually doing anything about them.
Well, I do think that Williams is going to be a more hands-on manager than Buttrose because she was pretty hands-off. But the interesting thing, too, is that this was not a captain's pick. This was not actually plucked out of the air by the PM to put one of his mates or somebody they thought was going to be ideologically compliant in there. They went through the actual management search process and he just applied, like he applied for the job, and he wound up getting it. So this is going to be, as I say, the media space in this country is going to be really interesting this year with this.
Now, very quickly, let's just talk about the basic backflip, the abandonment of the stage 3 tax cuts by Anthony Albanese, who lied to you at the last election, who took a policy forward. They have now lied about it, said they weren't going to change, and they are changing. They're trying basically to buy off certain voters at the expense of the more aspirational voters who are the backbone of this country. It's a straightforward numbers game. James, talk us through it.
Oh, this is just, I mean, it is absolutely outrageous. The incredible cynicism of the Albanese government here. If they hadn't lost the voice, the tax cuts would have gone through. Yep. But now they have to reset their agenda. They've decided, OK, well, we're going to mess with the stage 3 tax cuts, which they never liked anyway, even though, they were perfectly rational. Everybody else got their stage 1 and stage 2 cuts. They're called stage 3 for a reason. And that is to, among other things, correct the incredible bracket creep in this country. That top tax bracket of $180,000 came in 2007. If that tax bracket had been adjusted for inflation, it would be around $270,000 now. And yet we can't even talk about ever returning that money. This is the huge problem here is that it is going to be such a tax on aspiration. It is hitting people at incomes below where you need to have incomes to buy a house. It actually, you start to lose money at around 140, 145. And it also doesn't collect money from lots of people who don't file taxes. It doesn't give money back to them either. So this is just a bit of populist class warfare by the Albanese government, and it is going to, I think, hurt him very much in a lot of seats. I'm thinking of seats like Bennelong. I'm thinking of, a lot of these Teal seats that went for Teals to get Labor in. He's going to wind up opening a huge can of worms on this because who can trust him again? What else is on the table? Is the family home on the table? We saw they already went after super.
Almost.
Well, inheritance tax, possibly the family home. I mean, this is just the politics of envy. This is going after saying the rich, they're not paying any tax anyway. Well, guess what? The top 10% of taxpayers pay around half of all income tax that's collected. So the top 10%, those people who are going to receive the stage 3, pay disproportionate amount anyway, not just because they earn more, but because we've got a progressive tax system and the bracket creep has been a killer. But this isn't just going to hurt the top 10%, as James said. This is going to hurt a lot of everyday mum and dads working 2 jobs, trying to pay off a mortgage or save up for a house. And we saw Labor last year using race to divide and conquer. They failed there. Now they're doing the politics of envy, the rich and the poor.
Absolutely. And they're going to steal $28 billion estimated on bracket creep. That's coming out of your pockets, going straight into the government, money that should be in the economy. Quickly, James?
I was just going to say that this is just really the Albanese outlook on everything. He's got a real chip. He's got a real chip on his shoulder. This is the old "I fight Tories" elbow here.
100%.
And it's entirely about that sort of I'm going to stick it to those people who make too much money, and it is just saying no, just be middle, be average, but you get out of that. It's real tall poppy syndrome. It is the worst sort of stuff. We don't need it in an economy where our productivity is in the toilet, that the only thing that is holding up our GDP is a massive immigration Ponzi scheme, and instead of doing real tax reform, they've squibbed it and set us against one another. Do not fall for it.
Here, 100%.
And shame on all those media commentators who were pretending that Albanese was some sort of sensible centrist. This is a man whose his entire political career has been in the socialist left faction
It's called
of Labor.
communism, and it will destroy the prosperity of this country. Speaking of communists destroying the prosperity of the World Economic Forum this year met in Davos, and this is laughable. They want to rebuild trust. Yes, this is how rebuilding trust after wanting to make everyone own nothing and be happy. However, as many are now realising, this is just a guise for the globalist efforts to suppress views dissenting on their propaganda. Now, just have a quick listen to this. This is Ursula von der Leyen talking about rebuilding trust.
For the global business community, the top concern for the next 2 years is not conflict or climate. It is disinformation and misinformation.
Oh, where have we heard that? Disinformation and misinformation. This is called communist surveillance, propaganda and censorship. Joining us now is Webster University assistant Professor Ralph Schulham, a great friend of this show. Ralph, great to see you as always. What did you make? Do you think the World Economic Forum managed to rebuild the trust of the world in Davos this week?
Well, it's so great to see all of you. It's been way too long. No, I don't think they will, but there's such an irony, and you because you mentioned communism, but I have a sense, and I'm sure we're going to get to this topic in a second, I have a feeling that hammer and sickle is going to become a symbol of the right instead of the left in the months to come, because it's farmers and workers who have been shifted to the right. So this is very fascinating, and it's kind of the von der Leyens and so whoever are on the kind of quasi totalitarian left. Before the show, I looked up the political career of Ursula von der Leyen, and it's fascinating. She did not win a single election in her entire life, but always failed upward. So it's really like the old Soviet apparatchiks, right? They have absolutely no democratic legitimization. It's just the party that always kind of tried to, put them away, and they just stalled them in an ever higher position. So unfortunately, the comparison you made is, I think, probably more appropriate than one would wish.
Rita.
Well, fascinating things are happening across Europe. We've spoken about it before, this shift to the centre-right or the right in a number of countries. And even Sweden, they've got a centre-right coalition, and they're making a move against cashless society. To explain what's happening in Sweden.
Well, I think what we see happening, number one, is they're not entirely wrong in what they're saying. I think they just don't see that they are the problem. The erosion of trust is real. But I think the reason why trust is eroding all over the West is, look at many of the main issues that we have to deal with. And pretty much either they lied to the people, that's like the most malevolent interpretation, or they're just all horribly incompetent, or it's a mixture of both. But we have been lied in the area of energy, we have been lied to in the area of the economy, and in many ways we have been lied to when it comes to the dealing with the pandemic. So of course people no longer trust the government. And if now particularly those governments come in and say, so how about if we centrally control what you buy, when you buy it, and how you buy it, right? A growing number of people says, that doesn't sound right. And by the way, this is absolutely correct, because it's only a small step then to say, you buy a bottle of wine and pretty much the government knows, you bought a bottle of wine and whom did you vote for in the last election? So these things then all of a sudden become technically possible. And I completely understand that there is a certain resistance to this. So I'm not saying that we're moving all the way towards a social credit system, but it opens venues into that direction. And what we also see happening, banning opposition parties in Germany, banning Donald Trump from the ballot in the United States. Right? All these movements, I mean, there is a trend, ironically, that those who want to defend democracy seem to be very much at ease with potentially suspending democracy to stay in power. And that is a real danger.
James.
Ralph, we have a big debate happening right now in Australia about a sort of universal ID, digital ID program. They tried it years ago. They called it the Australia card. It didn't go anywhere because everybody said, nah, this is a bad idea. But I would love for you to have seen where this can go, to tell our Australian viewers what is the big concern, because the government says, oh, no, it just makes it real easy to do things and your medical records are here, that's all there, and it prevents fraud. They say it prevents fraud and, that sort of thing. But I think a lot of people are suspicious of this, and I'd love to hear you sort of explain why we should be very suspicious about the government trying to mandate this sort of collection of data and what it could be used potentially for, not tomorrow, but say at the next pandemic, which they keep for some reason very eagerly warning us is going to come around one of these days.
Oh, I can give you a precise reason why I'm worried about this. I mean, take two other countries as an example, the United States and the United Kingdom, your mother country, if I'm allowed to say this. There's a similar debate going on, but interestingly enough, there the argument, for example, when it comes to elections is, ID should not be necessary because it's apparently, which I think, by the way, is the most racist thing that one could say, that it's so hard for minorities and people of colors to get ID. But then what you just mentioned, right, apparently for the citizenship, for the legal immigrants, for the people who reside legally in a country, they should be ID'd up to the hill. Like,
yes,
we very often hear these stories about, these communities that live in the shadows. But let's be honest here. At some point, doesn't that living in the shadow almost sounds like, something nice, where you don't have, government-controlled currencies, government-controlled IDs. So this is very odd. So when it comes to elections, ID not necessary. But when it comes to the issues of your daily life, then you definitely should have an ID for everything else. That makes me suspicious. There is a sense that governments in the West are extremely capable of controlling their own people, but they're completely incapable of controlling their borders, controlling crime, and controlling illegal immigration. And I think that sentiment that people have, that distrust that is fed by this, is justified. I can only stress this enough. Like, there is something going on that is truly malevolent and that should worry us all.
And just very, very quickly, Ralph, the farmers' protests, just in 30 seconds, what's happening with the farmers' protests across Europe?
Finally, Germany, right? We've been talking about this for almost 2 years. Finally, the Germans rise up. There is this story from Lenin who said when the Germans try to storm a train, they buy first the ticket. So if the Germans start to move, then it means something. And one last sentence. All of this is great for a very simple reason. I cannot tell you how it ends, but this is what democracy is supposed to be. If people are dissatisfied, they can voice it, and then they can force governments to change course. So all these people that are, according to the mainstream media, a threat to democracy, they're exactly the opposite. They're the best example of a working democracy, and they deserve our full support, even if we don't agree with them on all the issues.
Fantastic, Ralph. So great to always talk to you, and I hope people notice that all those Germans protesting against climate change policies were protesting in thick, heavy snow. What an irony. Up next, Rita's reality check, and I'll be speaking to Dr. Franz Cronje about Israel and the ICJ.
You're watching Outsiders, and the team is back together for another year with Rowan, True Blue, Dinky Di, You Butte, Dean, James, always was, always will be, Morrow, and I'm Rita Gert by C. Panahy. Now, I'm sure, like me, you are thoroughly sick and tired of the annual self-flagellation unleashed by the media, celebrity, academia and activist class, and increasingly the corporate sector. Good morning, Brad. The Woolies boss. Do you know how much he gets paid? 8.5 million last year. 8.5 million. This divisive, race-based self-loathing, it's ugly, it's destructive, and mostly based on lies, just like the lies we heard during the left's failed push for the race-based voice. And yes, it's exactly the same miserable reality-denying miscreants that push the voice who are again pushing the Invasion Day narrative. The same corporates, the same sporting bodies and celebs and politicians who are all on the wrong side of history, but instead of accepting the referendum result, they're doubling down on this agenda. We have AFL clubs rubbishing Australia Day. The NRL put out this daft statement. Said the NRL acknowledges that today represents a painful and sorrowful day for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I'm sorry, does the NRL think that every Indigenous person in this country feels the same? That there's some homogenous group incapable of independent thought? The best thing about that NRL statement was all the league fans who posted Happy Australia Day messages under the announcement. It says plenty, though, about the ideological capture at these institutions that they are reckless enough to give the majority of their fans, the majority of Australians, the big finger, all for a little incoherent virtue signalling. Take the woke hypocrites at Tennis Australia, who didn't celebrate Australia Day at the Australian Open, but they did devote 2 days to an LGBTQIAA+ extravaganza.
Melbourne Park glowing with pride. Rainbow flags, sequins and colour as far as the eye could see, as Pride Day was celebrated for the 3rd year.
What's today all about?
Oh my gosh, today is all about colour, it's about fun, it's about visibility, representation and pride.
Yes, Tennis Australia really cares about the LGBT community, except it has for the 10th straight year partnered with Emirates. That would be the airline owned by the government of Dubai, of the United Arab Emirates, where homosexuality is considered a crime, punishable by imprisonment, beatings, chemical castration and even death under Sharia law. Yes, sadly, we've come to expect hypocrisy and idiocy from our leading sporting codes. But one would have hoped that after the nation went to a referendum on this agenda, that there'd be some awakening. But the left never concede defeat. They just doubled down with lies and emotional blackmail. And one of the biggest lies told about Australia Day is that January 26 marks invasion. And if we change the date, then all the enraged anti-Australia Day activists would be appeased and they'd join in celebrating our National Day. If you believe that, then you are a naive fool and you're part of the problem. Firstly, there was no invasion in any sense of the word on January 26. The first of the First Fleet ships arrived at Botany Bay on January 18. The remaining ships arrived on the following 2 days. January 26 marks the day when they raised the Union Jack flag a little further north at Sydney Cove. But it's never been about the date. It's about opposing any celebration of modern Australia, of all we've achieved thanks to Western civilisation.
I'm marching for land back and to end the colony.
In celebrating genocide.
We just got to educate those who say, just get over it. It's just, well, no, we just come to celebrate our own sovereignty.
Demonstrators dominated city streets for almost 5 hours, emboldened by Free Palestine protesters who joined in.
We're definitely coming out here in support of our brothers and sisters.
That was Melbourne, where lefty loons have destroyed a historic Captain Cook statue. They lopped off the 110-year-old bronze statue at the ankles and also wrote, "The colony will fall," in red paint on the memorial base. Now, why did they target a Captain Cook monument on the eve of Australia Day? The man was already dead when the First Fleet arrived in Australia, but the activist class is not too concerned with historical facts. They only want to destroy and oppose. And there's a real fear that good, well-meaning people who love this country and support Australia Day will be bullied into submission, convinced that the ugly divisiveness unleashed every single year will end if only we change the date. But trying to appease leftist activists is how we got into this current mess. It's what they count on to advance their culture war. The time for appeasement is over. It's time the majority of Australians push back for our shared values. Stop pandering to the perpetually aggrieved activists. Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price nailed it with a proposal to enshrine Australia Day on January 26 in legislation. And let's start focusing on the consequential issues afflicting Indigenous communities, the deplorable rates of abuse and neglect, the terrible outcomes despite the billions spent every year. You can be sure that the activists, celebrities and sporting bodies bleating loudest about Australia Day won't bother taking a stand on those issues.
Thank you, Rita. Well, the Israeli government has been charged, disgracefully in my opinion, with genocide by the government of South Africa, who took this ludicrous accusation to the so-called International Court of Justice, the ICJ. On Friday, the ICJ announced their findings, which was a bit of a mixed bag, including demanding that Israel make sure that genocide doesn't occur in Gaza, which is a bit like the old, when did you stop beating your wife? But what's really going on here is far more sinister than what it at first appears. Dr. Frans Cronje is the former CEO of South Africa's Institute of Race Relations. He joins us now. Dr. Cronje, thank you so much for coming on. You have drawn a terrifying comparison between Hamas, the butchers responsible for the atrocities of October 7th, the murders, the rapes, the mutilations, the kidnappings, and so on, and the government of South Africa with their claims against Israel. You accuse South Africa of being the plaything of the Ayatollahs in their declared goal of wiping Israel off the map. So let's get to the basics. Before we discuss the ICJ findings of the other day, tell me, Dr. Cronje, why did members of the South African government head straight to Tehran days after October 7th?
Well, there's a bit of a history here, and I think from the history we can get into what's going on in the present. The history is the South African government is incredibly corrupt, and over the past 25 years, it hasn't been averse to taking money from corrupt regimes and then offering diplomatic support for them on global fora. That goes all the way back to the Suharto regime in Indonesia, where South Africa's ruling party is alleged to have taken $50 million. They did the similar thing with the corrupt Abacha regime, which was absolutely a brutal, corrupt, autocratic and bloodthirsty. Money was taken from Saddam Hussein before the Iraq war, and in exchange South Africa soft-soaped the Iraqis and were very critical of that war, provided a lot of defense on global fora. With Gaddafi, the same thing happened again. So this isn't new to people who are informed and have watched the behavior of the South African government, and particularly of its ruling party. In the present, two things are happening. The South African strategy is twofold. As you know, as your viewers know, Iran uses proxies to prosecute its war against Israel and against the West beyond Israel. And you get armed proxies such as Hamas, Hezbollah and the like. They fight with guns and bombs and sort of traditional military means. But the Iranians understand that Israel is too strong diplomatically, financially, economically, and militarily to be summarily overrun. And so there's another front to the Iranian war against the West, and that's the diplomatic front. And it's here where South Africa comes in. It does have the history, the country, of apartheid and the victory against that and the rise of the formal democracy in 1994. And while that's partly tarnished, given the corruption that has came along with liberation, the position of the country as a bastion of the idea of human liberty and civil rights still lives on to a certain extent. The South Africans are aiding the Iranians in two ways. The first is to poison in the West the idea of Israel, an opinion against Israel. And the very specific desire there is to so poison Western opinion that particularly the US Congress in the fullness of time starts to make support for Israel, and particularly military support, conditional to a point that it hems in the ability of Israel's battlefield commanders to fend off the ring of fire of the armed Iranian proxies that surround that country. The second objective for the South Africans is to so stigmatize young Jews around the world that service in the IDF becomes increasingly controversial and very, very difficult. And if the South Africans can aid the Iranians in achieving both objectives to any extent at roughly the same time, you cut off a lot of the external aid for Israel, you fracture domestic consensus within Israel amongst young Israelis about service in the IDF, and you then greatly raise the vulnerability of Israel either to future armed incursions or to being forced into a series of negotiated settlements that will piece by piece dismember, disable, and eventually destroy the Jewish state. Right.
You draw parallels, Dr. Cronje, with the genocide and apartheid claims against Israel by South Africa and in the World Fora. You draw parallels between that and the way America lost the war in Vietnam. Can you briefly explain that, Dr. Cronje?
Yeah, I think for any Westerner who's grown up in the post-Cold War world, I think a weakness in the West is the idea that the Cold War was won. And if you're a young political leader today in the West, or think tank leader, or policymaker, or national security person, you've probably grown up in an environment where you do not have living memory experience of ideological warfare and how powerful that can be in giving a less well-armed, less well-equipped terror organization, for example, the ability to challenge a much better equipped, much wealthier, much more prosperous, much more technologically advanced adversary. Now, towards the final stages of the Vietnam War, and the Vietnamese were very good at this stuff. They were backed by the East Germans, obviously, and the Soviets, who at the time were the masters of the art. And South Africa's then liberation movements, or the centerpiece of that, was the African National Congress, the party that still governs South Africa today. They went to visit the Vietnamese, and particularly General Giap, still in the tunnels in Vietnam. And they learned a great deal about ideological warfare from there, and then later themselves from the East Germans and the Soviets. And I think the comment that a lot of Western observers of this current conflict in Gaza need to have in mind is the lament that the Supreme Commander of the US forces in Vietnam later agreed with, General Westmoreland, that the Americans lost the war there, not in the jungles of Southeast Asia, but on the streets of Washington and in the living rooms of America. And I think there's a risk within Israel, within its security establishment. I think it's a risk that exists, and vulnerability amongst Western national security thinkers broadly, that their unrivaled economic and technological and military superiority keeps them safe. And what they're going to learn out of this ICJ case that's just passed and related efforts on the part of the South Africans is that if your defensive strategies, if your deterrence ability to head off ideological attacks and diplomatic attacks on the scale of what the South Africans launched, I mean, what the South Africans launched was the diplomatic version of October the 7th. If you cannot fend off those kinds of attacks effectively in the fullness of time, your technological and traditional military advantages will be eroded to a point that you become very vulnerable to threats posed by autocratic societies or terror groups such as Hamas.
And just very, very briefly, Dr. Cronje, we're seeing these protests in Australia, around the Western world, exactly as happened in Vietnam, so I think your analogy is very valid. Just very quickly, in 30 seconds, your opinion on what happens now that the ICJ has made this kind of half-baked ruling.
Well, I think it's perverse. You know, the ICJ is bought into the South African thesis to a far too deep an extent, and the kind of messaging that you do need out of the Western world is to thank the Israelis and thank the brave soldiers of the IDF and thank their family members, because what they're doing in Gaza today and in other parts of the Middle East is heading off a very dangerous threat to the Western world broadly. And if that fight can't be won in Gaza, if it can't be won in the frontline states around Israel, in the fullness of time, you, your family, and your kids in Western capitals are going to face the consequences of that. So, yeah, hopefully Western democracies learn to see through this, learn to see through the fact that the UN as an institution is dominated by non-liberal democratic states. They shouldn't be ceding any moral authority to that institution or any panel or subcommittee, the ICJ included, that is linked or tied to it or falls underneath.
Dr. Frans Cronje, thank you so much for coming on Outsiders this morning with these wise words and warnings. Stay safe. Thank you very much, Dr. Frans Cronje. Coming up, lots more in a tick. You're watching Outsiders with the recently returned Rita Panahi with James Morrow and myself, Rowan Dean. Thank you so much for watching us every Sunday morning. We certainly do appreciate your company. Now, regular viewers of the show won't be surprised that Donald Trump is clearly going to be the Republican nominee for the presidential election later in November, and I suspect he will win. I've said all along I think he'll be the next president. I certainly hope so. One of the scandals that's come up in the past couple of weeks has been to do with Carrie Lake. You will remember we interviewed Carrie Lake here on Outsiders a couple of years ago. But this is a fascinating story. James, take us through it.
This is absolutely wild. It is a scandal of, I think, huge proportions that really has not gotten anywhere near enough coverage. Carrie Lake is running again for the Senate from Arizona. She was visited by Jeff DeWitt. He is the head of the Republican Party in Arizona, and he tried to get her, a strong MAGA pro-Trump candidate, to drop out of the race and said, you know what, we can arrange corporate jobs, millions of dollars, just don't run again. This audio leaked. Have a listen to this little bit of it.
So what's going on? What is, I'm assuming this is our friend.
This is back east. There are very powerful people that want to keep you out.
I know they do.
But they're willing to put their money where their mouth is in a big way. So, this conversation never happened.
This is crazy, though. They should want me. I'm a great candidate. People love me. These people are corrupt.
Well, maybe you're right.
So this conversation went back and forth for 5 or 6 minutes. There's a lot of disturbing stuff in there because there was mentions of drug cartels. There's talk about the people back east. You know, the guy DeWitt there even makes a joke about starting his car in the morning and getting blown up. Now, I don't know what to make of that, but the fact is there are really powerful forces in the Republican Party who do not want Trump to run. No. This is the swamp that he's running against, not just Biden.
Well, that connects to our next story, because this insane case and this insane defamation payment of $83 million US that Trump has been ordered to pay. I mean, this entire story, please look into it. Don't just read the headline, because this is banana republic territory. This is insane that there was no proof of any assault. In fact, no conviction of any type. Trump is then pursued. A law is invented so he can be pursued for defaming her, basically, for saying she's crazy, I've never met her, I've never assaulted her. And the so-called defamation, and the reason she got $83 million is that this woman who's in her 70s lost her column, I think it was with Elle magazine. Now, the magazine's come out and said, we sacked her, had nothing to do with her dealings with Trump. But they've decided this column with Elle magazine amounts to $83 million worth of reputational and damage and lost earning. I mean, the whole thing where he's being pursued on these trumped-up charges with judges who are appointed by Democrats in areas where they're voting 80% Democrats when they know the jury pool is going to want to get him. It is so corrupt. It is completely undermining trust in the justice system.
This is the whole thing. This whole banana republic thing. We talked about it last year. They're trying to jail or silence the opposition leader because he's a threat to the regime. This is the sort of thing that happens in a place like Pakistan, not the United States. And, you know, you're right about the law, because what they said here, basically, because you went out there and said you're not guilty of the crime, you're now guilty of another crime. And that's essentially what they're saying. It's Orwellian, and it is just a sneak preview, guys, of what they're going to do to Trump. We've seen insane things like how they accused him of undervaluing Mar-a-Lago at it said, oh, it's only worth $25 million, but it's this 100-room club on the beach with an income stream, but it's only worth $25 million. This is the sort of nonsense and lunacy that these leftist judges, leftist prosecutors, and in a place like New York, he's not going to get a fair trial, leftist juries are all going to throw at him.
Or somewhere in DC where they voted, 96% for Hillary Clinton. So, but the Republicans have to fight fire with fire. They've got to do the same thing in areas where it's heavily Republican. I think it's the only thing that's going to stop them is if they see the same tactics used against them. Because at the moment, it's a one-way street. And it's the reason why he's going to be the candidate. Because remember, when we first started talking about who was going to be the Republican candidate, and we're talking a lot about Ron DeSantis, there was like 2 points between them. Then the indictments, these
the more they attack
persecution started, not prosecution, persecution.
Yes.
And the Republican voters said, well, wait, no, we're going to back
The more
our
they
man.
try and attack him, the more likely it is he will be the president. But the tricks they are going to pull, the shenanigans they are up to, is just disgraceful. One good thing is Trump has already said that he will decimate climate policies if he gets back in. So we should all be looking forward to that.
He needs to go scorched earth, not on climate policies, but on the swamp. That was his greatest failure. When he went in there, I think he thought he could work with the machinery and they weren't going to work against him every step of the way.
We'll talk more about this, Rita. Sorry, I've got to cut you off. Always great to hear Rita, have her back. But sometimes I just have to step in, just doing my job. Up next,
patriarchy.
Commercial break, and then lots more here on Outsiders in a tick. Hello, you're watching Outsiders with Rita, pin-up girl, Panahi, on lead vocals, percussion and penny whistle, James, megastar Morrow, on lead guitar, maracas and harmonica, and myself, Rowan, rockstar Dean, on spoons and ukulele. Yes, the band is back together, and we will rock you right here every Sunday morning for the rest of the year with our opinions. Yes, this is an opinion show, and I promise you there will be no shortage of opinions this year. Here's an opinion from Jordan Peterson, the well-known Canadian psychologist, which I feel compelled to share with you this morning.
And I'm more and more convinced that there was no damn pandemic at all. I'm convinced on that front, not least in part because there's not a lot of data showing excess mortality in Sweden, for example, during the pandemic years. What we had instead, and conservatives should probably stop talking about the pandemic as such, what we had was an outbreak of 2 years of totalitarian governance, and that was the bloody pandemic.
Ooh, so do I share that opinion? Well, interestingly, a top scientist has written to the UK COVID inquiry saying that the BBC, quote, misrepresented the virus to boost lockdown support. But do I think there was no bloody pandemic? Do I think that what we actually had was 2 years of totalitarian governance? In the immortal words of Francis Urquhart.
Now, you might very well think that, but of course I couldn't possibly comment.
But this show is called Outsiders, the Opinion Show, so let's humour Jordan's opinion for just a second. If there was no actual pandemic, then the lockdowns and school closures and mask wearing and QR codes and mandatory vaccines were not only largely ineffective, but also entirely unnecessary. Oh, hang on. That's pretty much what I was saying on this show way back. Oh, anyway. And if there was no actual pandemic, then we didn't need to spend and blow billions of your tax dollars on JobKeeper and the shutting down of huge swathes of our economy. Much like I was saying back... anyway. And if there was no pandemic, well, Scott Morrison's supposed legacy of managing the pandemic is utterly delusional, fanciful nonsense. Yes, Scott Morrison resigned this week from politics, and he's been given a rather tasty job with Mike Pompeo, Donald Trump's former right-hand man. I wonder what was on Mr. Morrison's CV that so attracted Mr. Pompeo. Could it have been this, in my opinion, Scotty's finest moment?
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows the rule on crops.
It's coal. It was dug up by men and women who work and live in the electorates of those who sit opposite. From the Hunter Valley, as the member for Hunter would know. It's coal that has ensured for over 100 years
the Deputy Prime Minister
has enjoyed an energy competitive advantage that has delivered prosperity to Australian businesses and has ensured that Australian industry has been able to remain competitive on a global market.
Sadly, that was when Mr. Morrison was a politician worth listening to and voting for. Before he did a bigger backflip than Albo's tax betrayal and adopted net zero at Glasgow COP26, which finished him off and his career, by the way. I doubt Mr. Pompeo was particularly impressed by the net zero disgrace. However, what is more likely is that Mike Pompeo was very, very impressed by the way Scott Morrison stood up to China, especially how the Morrison government tore up the sinister deal done between the socialist state of Victoria under the pugnacious pro-Chinese Premier Dan Andrews and the Communist Chinese Party, the so-called Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative was cancelled in April 2021 and was a highly significant move by the Morrison government to protect the national security of this nation. But here's the thing. The Morrison government only made this important move after the Americans had learnt about the deal and presumably kicked up a fuss about it. But how did Mike Pompeo, who was then Donald Trump's Secretary of State, actually learn about the deal? Simple. By being on Outsiders. In your superb speech here in Sydney last year, you quipped that you can sell your soul for a can of soya beans. The Victoria Labor state government in Australia is in the middle of signing up to China's Belt and Road Initiative to the tune of potentially billions of dollars.
We will not take any risk to our telecommunications infrastructure, any risk to the national security elements of what we need to do with our Five Eyes partners. We're going to protect and preserve the security of those institutions. So I don't know the nature of those projects precisely, but to the extent they have an adverse impact on our ability to protect telecommunications from our private citizens or security networks for our defense and intelligence communities, we will simply disconnect. We will simply separate. We're going to preserve trusted networks for important information. We hope our friends and partners and allies across the world, especially our Five Eyes partners like Australia, will do the same.
Now, that interview was greeted with hysteria by the left, with The Guardian and the ABC and other lefty rags attacking me, attacking the fringe show Outsiders, and claiming I'd caused a diplomatic storm. Good, because 11 months later, the Morrison government reacted to that storm by cancelling Victoria's Belt and Road deal. You can thank me later, Scotty. Now, on a more serious note, yesterday, January 27th, the day after Australia Day, was International Holocaust Remembrance Day. This year was undoubtedly the most significant January 27 since the idea was established by a resolution in the United Nations General Assembly in 2005. Why it took them so long, I don't know. A resolution to honour the 6 million Jews who perished in the Nazis' industrialised murder of 2/3 of the Jewish population of Europe, 1/3 of the Jewish population of the world, along with the other victims of Hitler's vile regime. A key plank of the Holocaust Remembrance Resolution was education, and a commitment from the nations of the world to educate young people about the evil perpetrated by the violent thugs of the Third Reich frequently aided and spurred on gleefully by frenzied locals, all in the name of a vile political ideology which viewed certain people, because of their genetic makeup, as subhuman, Untermensch, and therefore worthy of the most disgusting degradation, abuse, torture, rape, mutilation, and killings of innocent Jewish men, women, and children. Clearly, we have failed, because 2023 will go down in history for the massacres of October the 7th, when the terrorists of Hamas, aided and spurred on by some frenzied Palestinians, committed the most disgusting degradation, abuse, torture, rape, mutilation, and killings of innocent Jewish men, women, and children, all over again. Indeed, the evil perpetrated by Hamas and its fellow travellers even manages to eclipse the Nazis in terms of its sheer barbarity, and worse, the glee with which the bloodlust was carried out and supported by cheering crowds, not only in Gaza, but right around the world, including here in Australia, on the steps of the Opera House and the streets of Greenacre.
Smiling and I'm happy. I'm elated. It's a day of courage. It's a day of happiness. It's a day of pride. It's a day of victory. This is the day we've been waiting for.
But unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. There has been a systematic campaign to downplay the atrocities of October 7th and to simultaneously blame the Jews for what was done to them, with idiotic comments such as, "History didn't begin on October 7th." Then we also learned, for example, on the very day we are supposed to be educating children about the Holocaust, in the UK, 3 schools have pulled out of Holocaust education run by the Anne Frank Trust due to community tensions. I wonder what communities those might be. In my humble opinion, if, in the current state of affairs, you overtly sympathise with militant Palestinian aspirations, if you offer your support to the crowds chanting "From the river to the sea," if you seek to make excuses for the atrocities of October 7th or question the veracity of those horrors, you are no better than those who supported and cheered Hitler and the Nazis, and history will treat you with similar contempt and disdain. Which is why I am increasingly horrified by the gullibility and sheer stupidity of those who buy into the moronic concept of the oppressors versus the oppressed, which is taught ubiquitously in our schools and universities, even kindergartens now, and increasingly adopted in our corporate boardrooms. This asinine undergraduate ideology that reduces all the world's problems to racism or sexism or colonialism, and perpetually seeks to justify the most contemptible and vile behaviour. It starts with justifying vandalising statues, but as we have seen in the United States, it can swiftly turn into justifying shop looting or even justifying random attacks on white people or Jews. And from there, it's not a big leap to justifying any violence, rape or murder, on the grounds, so long as it can be portrayed as resistance to colonial occupation or resistance to white supremacy. The hard left, Labor and the Greens, indulge this stupid ideology, and indeed many of them believe it. Hence, on Australia Day, we saw the deliberate linking of the Aboriginal flag and the pro-Palestinian flag, with the linkage of the pro-Palestinian agenda and First Nations claims apparently being a common theme amongst all the speeches, culminating in this disgusting new slogan, quote, "From the river to the sea, always was, always will be." If that slogan does not send a shiver down your spine, I don't know what would. Do I need to spell it out for the dim of thinking? The first part of that slogan demands the removal of all Jews from the land of Israel in order to establish a Palestinian state on the laughable and sick historical falsehoods that the Palestinians were there first and the Jews are the white colonial occupiers. Hitler must be chortling in his grave. The second part of that slogan erases the laws and constitution of this land and erases 200 years of European settlement and erases the rights of every migrant who ever set foot on this land and believes themselves and their children to be equal citizens of this land. If the nutjobs on the hard left believe that the atrocities of October 7th are justified in the name of Palestinian rights, well, what horrors would those same nutjobs be prepared to justify in the name of First Nations rights? The idiots who indulge this sort of dangerous nonsense, namely our political leaders of the left, are playing with fire of the most dangerous and destructive kind. The sooner they are turfed out of office, the better. Well, we often complain about the state of politics in Australia, the elites there in Canberra, the Canberra swamp who run the whole show. The Liberals in the past haven't been quite as strong as we would have liked them to have been. As a result, the Liberals have found themselves in some areas becoming irrelevant and unelectable, leaving a gaping hole in Australia's political landscape. How do we fix the problem? This is something I'm asked all the time. Well, joining us now to discuss this is the expelled New South Wales Liberal State Executive Member, Matthew Kamanzula. Matthew, welcome to Outsiders. Great to have you on. Now, you were expelled, you can tell us about that in a second, from the Liberal Party during the Morrison years. But you've recently become very active in promoting the idea of grassroots Conservative support for the Liberal Party and other parties not of the left. Talk us through it.
Well, look, I think it's very, very important, if people are unhappy right now with what they're seeing in the political landscape, that they step up and get involved, be a part of it. I mean, I myself was just a small business owner, didn't like the way things were headed many years ago, joined the party and ended up finding myself on the state executive and all of the other things that happened since. You can affect change, but you can't do it from outside. You have to do it from inside. I mean, it's outsiders and become an outsider. But at the end of the day, change must be affected from within. And there are more good people inside of the Liberal Party that believe in the Menzies We Believe statement, that want to see the party go back to its roots, go back to its core. And they do need more people to help them do that. It is a matter of numbers. It's a matter of people power. It really is. The system serves the members, or it must. Otherwise, the system breaks.
Rita. Is it that simple, or are there restrictions? Because I keep hearing about people wanting to join and having applications rejected. It seems incredible that you've got the party, and it's not just the Liberal Party, it's also the National Party in many instances, where they are not representative of their voter base. The people getting pre-selected seem to belong sometimes in the wrong party altogether.
Sure. Look, I think there is certainly an element of political game playing that goes on within the organisation. But again, all of that can be fixed through membership. There's an AGM, for example, there's an AGM coming up at the end of February within the Liberal Party, where they'll get to choose who the state executive are, who the president is, all these sorts of things. And all of the Liberal Party's fortunes are downstream from the organisation. People don't see it. It's very, very important. But the organisation, the party, is who is in charge of pre-selections and can curate membership. And if you have the right people in the position of party president and state executive and all those sorts of things, you can really see a big change in the organisation. And it's starting to happen.
Okay, so let's talk about the New South Wales division of the Liberal Party, which is where I think an awful lot of people will look at and agree that there's a lot of things wrong, and some of the people that we've seen come up and rise in that, and the way that some people who we thought were quite sound and conservative got pulled to the left, that there's obviously some issues there. So how is it just simply that getting more people into the system is going to fix this? Because it seems you have a big problem with a lobbyist culture and a factional culture associated with that means that you have people looking at the party less as a way to push Menzian conservative principles and more as a way to, push ideas that most people in the grassroots, like renewable subsidies and all sorts of other nonsense and, woke stuff in the classrooms and so on. And again, also, Rita said the Nationals too, which at the state level have been taken over by a very sort of far left group of people who don't even live in the country.
Yeah.
I think that was James's quick way of saying, how do we get the woke out of the Liberal Party?
Thank you, Rowan.
Look, I think that's a fantastic question. So membership is a big part of that. People need to join because it is a numbers game, and it really does have an impact. You can really put pressure on politicians from inside. But also, it's a matter of leadership and political courage at the top. Now, I think people like Peter Dutton are actually, a force for good in the party. We need to see more political courage. We need to see more strength at the top, driving that back down through the culture as well of the organisation.
This seems to be a fundamental problem with Conservatives in this country, because for every fighter, we seem to have dozens of these quislings who don't understand that politics is an adversarial game. With Labor, they're battle-hardened. They've gone through those factional wars. They like the fight. They're good at the fight. Whilst Conservatives seem to be better at governing than they are at actually politicking. Yeah, look, I think what we saw with even the state government in New South Wales, for those that were following it, they thought they were an extension of the bureaucracy. Yeah. They were all, you start hearing them say words like peak body and all these other things. It's very, very difficult to hear as a passionate, committed, strong Liberal who believes that there are certain ideologies that made this country great. We need to really push. We almost have to push against the bureaucracy, against the machine. I mean, we saw with the voice vote, the ACT was 70%. 70%, yes. The whole rest of the country was no. They're so out of step. They're so lost. And just trying to pretend that you're somehow a captain or a part of being captured by that machine, all you're really doing is putting yourself out of business slowly. Australians don't want their Liberal Party to be Teals. They don't want their Liberal Party to be left wing. I think if I was to look at Scott Morrison's political epitaph, it would simply say, if you leave your friends to work with their enemies, you lose your friends and their enemies don't respect you.
100%, 100%.
It's that simple.
So you're telling people go and get involved. How literally can they do that, and how do they present themselves as Conservatives? How do they get in there and get a Conservative voice heard? We saw all the nonsense in the last election, which seemed to be Scott Morrison's fault, of pre-selection chaos in New South Wales in particular. Victoria, Rita will tell you, is a complete write-off. How do you get those Conservatives in there?
Well, I wouldn't want to get anyone in any trouble, but I've got a website that you can go to and register
tell us the details. No,
so
let's put it up on the screen. What is it?
Yeah, it's MatthewCamanzuli.com.
MatthewCamanzuli.com.
If you go there, you will be able to essentially register yourself and tell us a bit about yourself, and we can help you navigate the silly hoops and loops that you might have to go through in order to get in, because there is a certain culture in the organisation and it isn't as easy to get through. But if you have a little bit of knowledge and know some of the right people, which I may happen to do, you can certainly get passage in and you can be a part of the change.
Well, this is an important point, because we say get involved, join up, but it's not always that simple, because there are people putting roadblocks.
So we've got that up on the screen, Matthew. Just check that. Are you happy with that? There we go, MatthewCamanzuli.com. So how do you get Conservatives into Rita's ghastly Victorian Liberal Party, for example?
Well, look, I'm a massive fan of Moira Deeming.
Yes, fantastic.
She's not in the Liberal Party.
No, she's not.
She's like you. We need Matthew.
She's keen to see change, you see, inside of the Liberal Party. And she's got a lot of friends inside of the organisation too. Good. I mean, the best way to get in is probably go and see your most prominent former Liberal, and they'll tell you how to do it, right? But the organisation has to stop expelling people. Now, there's an interesting motion that's going to come up on the agenda of the next State Council AGM, State Executive AGM at the end of the month in February, and that is there's a motion to expel Alex Hawke, which you may or may not know about, and to bring me back into the party. But it's not just
there you
about
go. That's something. We're going to leave it there, but there you go. You've got that as well to contemplate. Libs, get involved with the Liberal and National parties, because we need Conservatives out there, because Peter Dutton must be the next Prime Minister, in my opinion, to save this country. After the break, James's donkey vote, and we've got Rachel Wong as well to chat to in a tick.
Hello, you're watching Outsiders with the revanchist Rowan Dean and Rita Red State Panahy. And in a moment, We're going to take a look at Joe Biden's bogus attempt to shut down the biggest border crisis America has ever seen, and how America is rapidly heading for a constitutional crisis because of the Democrats' insistence on letting millions of people enter the country illegally every year. But first, speaking of Joe Biden, the president was out touring a brewery in Wisconsin on Friday, and, well, let's just say he sounded like a few of you might have after a long day chatting at the Australia Day barbecues. Have a listen.
Maybe it's the beer talking, Marge, but you got a butt that won't quit. They got these big chewy pretzels here that are, oh, you guys with the beer, you know, $5? Get out of here.
Wait, no. I said President Biden, not Homer Simpson. Let's try this again.
Beer brewed here, it is used to make the brew beer in this refinery. Oh, Earth Rider, thanks for the Great Lakes. I wonder why it's trying.
Please do go on, Mr. President.
I'm proud to announce $1 billion from the bipartisan infrastructure law will be.
Infrastructure, he sort of got it there, but it's a pretty big word for an 80-year-old president, I suppose. Anyway, again, also in his speech, there were the usual battles with the teleprompter.
My professor, well, I won't get into my professor. Well, look, my predecessor, though.
Do you get the sense that he's just playing this up, that he thinks this is some kind of nightclub act? I mean, you know, Shecky Biden, the laugh-a-minute demented president. Come see him tonight. Oh, yeah, by the way, also, of course, in the speech, there was the usual random screaming.
It cost $10 to make it. $10 to make it.
$10 to make it! The sea was angry that day, my friends. And, of course, there was always a bit more of the weird whispering.
And thanks to the outstanding senators, Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin, Tammy's the one, and Amy Klobuchar and Tina Smith from the state of Minnesota. If I have all three of them on my side, I don't worry about anything.
It's all the greatest hits. I tell you what, though, God, this guy's got to get some new material. Anyway, seriously, on to the crisis at the southern border and what many commentators are now calling an invasion of the United States by illegal migrants. Have a look at this footage here. What you're seeing on your screen is footage that was reportedly taken in La Jolla, California this week, Thursday. It shows what appears to be some sort of speedboat, a landing craft, beaching itself on the Southern Californian coast. Now, migrants quickly get off the boat and start making a break for it into the surrounding neighborhood, pursued by cops, but it is unclear whether any of them were actually apprehended. And this group here, you see, well, that's just a drop in the bucket, because not long after that footage came to light, Customs and Border Protection in the U.S. dropped their latest figures and revealed that a record 302,034 so-called encounters with illegal migrants along just the southern border alone happened last year, adding to the total 10 million illegals who have come to the United States since the start of the Biden administration. 10 million. Now, 19 of those seekers, by the way, looking for a new life in the land of opportunity as part of that 300,000 who came out in December, well, it turns out they were also on the terror watch list. So go figure. But if you think this is news, there's a lot more to this story that is not being reported. For one thing, the United States is rapidly hurtling towards a constitutional crisis over the legitimacy of the Biden administration's essentially open borders policies. Policies which we can only assume are designed to bring a whole new constituency of migrants, newcomers into the United States, and then eventually, in some sort of horrifying cynicism masquerading as compassion, because that's what the left always do, grant them amnesty and citizenship in the hopes of locking in their votes for the Democrats forever. Here's, though, where it gets really crazy. This week, the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, sent a letter to the president accusing him of failing to uphold his oath of office by allowing migrants to walk in virtually unchallenged. for not enforcing the law. The immediate trigger of this was a fight over Texas' placement of razor wire at the Eagle Pass crossing to deter migrants, and the Biden administration's bogus fake news claims that Texas's effort to seal the border at that point led to the tragic drowning deaths of 3 people, including children. This was, of course, a lie. It was fake news. And now, in response, along with Texas, 25 other states have all signed on and signified their support for the letter, setting up a crisis for the Biden administration, which now has in the position where it has either to do nothing and see their authority challenged, or fight back and look like they want to facilitate this very invasion. Now, imagine that. The media has all but ignored this story, of course, because it looks bad for Biden and it makes him look weak, which is why I'm sharing it with you now. But as if that's not enough, check this out. These pictures were taken by Brett Weinstein in Darien, Panama, where migrants are transiting from around the world to enter the U.S. You see the logos of UN and American aid agencies and something called the Global Brigades, all working to help these migrants get up and into the U.S., as well as tent villages with signage in Chinese, which really makes you wonder what exactly is going on here. Now, what it looks like to me is a coordinated effort by NGOs and the UN and other global left-wing charities, I use that word advisedly, to weaken and flood America's border and eventually sovereignty. So as for Joe Biden, well, his administration is trying to act like they're the good guys here. They're trying to broker a deal with Congress over the border that would allow the government to shut it down for a day if they have more than 5,000 illegal crossings. Which brings, of course, the question, why not just shut the damn thing down full stop? Enforce the law that allows you to deport illegal immigrants. Oh, and also the Biden administration wants to provide for the hiring of a whole bunch more agents and personnel. Not, it should be noted, to stop people from crossing, but to process them into the U.S. and the system more quickly. You begin to see, when you look at all of that, why the governor of Texas sent his letter, and why, when it comes to failing to protect the country, Greg Abbott is right about Joe Biden.
Fantastic. Thanks, James. Well, there's been a concerning development in New South Wales as a new so-called equality bill is being brought before the state parliament. Joining us now to discuss the harm she believes this new legislation will impose, if passed, is Women's Forum CEO Rachel Wong. Rachel, great to see you. Thanks for coming on Outsiders. You've been warning about this bill. Tell us the history of it, what it means, and why you are so concerned about it.
Thank you for having me on, Rowan. So this bill was introduced by independent MP Alex Greenwich last year in August into the New South Wales Parliament. It's set to be debated on the 8th of February. It includes a whole raft of incredibly concerning reforms. It's been introduced under the guise of equality for LGBT people, and yet at the same time undermines protections and rights for women and children. So there are too many things, to be honest, to discuss in relation to its content, because it amends a huge number of bills and introduces a huge number of amendments. But in particular, we're concerned about the introduction of sex self-ID, which will mean that anyone can change their legal sex, including children, and be considered as that sex for all intents and purposes under law. It also removes almost all of the remaining regulations and restrictions around prostitution, including coercing people into prostitution. That will be removed, as well as soliciting prostitution in or near schools, churches and hospitals. And it also introduces overseas commercial surrogacy, meaning that residents in New South Wales can go over to poor, disadvantaged countries and basically exploit women over there, rent their wombs, buy the children, bring them back to New South Wales, and that be entirely legal. So those are some of the concerning reforms that the bill includes. And it's been, as I said, debated on the 8th of February. It's been rushed through, to be honest, because it was introduced in August last year. It was announced at the end of last year that it will be debated in February, which is the first parliamentary sitting week of Parliament. There's been very little to no consultation with concerned women's and children's groups. Of course, there's been plenty of consultation with LGBT groups, particularly trans activists, including the likes of ACON, who are responsible for embedding gender ideology throughout Australian institutions like media, like business, like government. So, yeah, it's incredibly concerning, the content and the process surrounding it. And a lot of New South Wales residents don't even know that it's happening. And that's not their own fault at all, because it hasn't really been publicised. As I said, it's basically been rammed through.
Well, yeah, I don't recall this being an enormous election issue, so I don't think anyone was voting for this. But you mentioned self-ID. Does that mean we could have the situation where a man who identifies as a woman would end up in a female prison, for example? Because we've already got that happening in Victoria. We've got sexual predator we know of who is imprisoned in a women's prison, and the women there have got petitions. They've got all sorts of campaigns to have something done about this, but neither political side in Victoria is interested in hearing from them.
That's exactly one of the ramifications, Rita. So men who identify as women will be able to have that legally recognised in law, and be able to access, for example, female prisons, bathrooms, changing rooms, refuges, all those kinds of things. And there won't be anything that women can do to stop them from being included in those what should be female-only spaces. And for good reason. We know that things are broken up by sex because women are more at threat of biological males in relation to things like sexual assault or physical abuse or whatever. And so this bill will effectively eradicate single-sex spaces.
James.
And I mean, just on that also, you mentioned that even kids could self-ID. We've seen all sorts of problems around the world where young people have decided to self-ID as being of another gender. When their parents object, in some jurisdictions, we've seen this in the United States, the parents can have their kids taken away from them. They can be charged. Is there a danger that this then opens up the door to that sort of real attack on the family and the family unit and parental authority out of this bill? Yeah,
so this particular bill allows children under 16 to change their legal sex without their parents' consent if NCAT determines that it's reasonable. What's also concerning, though, is that there is other legislation also afoot in New South Wales, which Greenwich has also been involved with, and which the Labor government in particular is pushing, which relates to conversion therapy, bans on conversion therapy, which, to be honest, is just a Trojan horse for embedding gender ideology further into the state. And if that particular bill is anything like what we've seen in places like Victoria and anything like what Greenwich's draft bill has been like, then it will indeed criminalise parents and doctors and others who are trying to provide care to children who are struggling with gender dysphoria in a way that doesn't simply affirm their gender identity.
Absolutely. James, quickly.
Very quickly, Rachel, just because Alex Greenwich is such a power broker in the New South Wales Parliament, the Chris Minns government relies on him for a lot of stuff. What are the chances of this getting up?
Look, I think there are very high chances, but I think that if politicians, particularly Labor politicians, hear from their constituents, then there's a chance that they could realise this is not what the people want, and there's a chance that some of these amendments, at least, could be reconsidered. But in addition to contacting Labor members, I think it's really important for the Libs to actually stand up against this. I know in Queensland last year, the Liberals actually voted as a bloc against self-ID, so I'd hope to at least see that from the Liberals in New South Wales, if not more, if not actual strong opposition against these incredibly harmful reforms.
So, Rachel, we want the Libs in New South Wales. Come on, Libs, find your backbone, stand up, support Rachel on this, and all parents, speak to your Liberal MPs. Let's get behind this thing. Rachel, have you got a petition? Should people go to womensforumaustralia.org?
Yes, we do have a petition at womensforumaustralia.org/protect New South Wales. There's already over 8,500 signatures. We expect a lot more over the next couple of weeks before the bill's debated.
Fantastic. Well, we'll get you a lot more today. Let's get on to that, folks. We're going to take a short break now. Sorry, we'll talk more about it. Thanks, Rachel, so much. Coming up, we've got the Canberra Clown Show to go to. See you in a tick.
There.
Roll up, step right this way for the Canberra Clown Show, the new segment of Outsiders that after only one show can already claim its first scalp. As we reported earlier in Outsiders News this morning, After I savaged Penny Wong the clown for supporting the insidious UNRWA organisation with your tax dollars that go to educating Palestinian kids, arguably to murder and hate Jews, well, yesterday we got the magnificent news that Penny Wong, the foreign minister, has suspended Australian aid to UNRWA. Round of applause, everybody. It only took us 1 week, but now on with the show. This week, featuring the amazing acrobatics of the Labour caucus, and this week's astonishing backflip, expertly performed by Albozo the Clown, right in the spotlight at the National Press Club. Oops, sorry, our mistake. That's the elegant way for clowns to perform a backflip. Here's the slightly less elegant way. First, you have to lay the groundwork.
I've always been a man of my word. I've got a great team and I'm the captain. People are entitled to have that certainty of the tax cuts that have been legislated, and we won't be changing them. Parliament made a decision to legislate those tax cuts, and we made a decision that we would stand by that legislation rather than relitigate it, and we haven't changed our opinion. The government hasn't changed our position. That's me being economically literate. That is me being economically literate. I've said our position hasn't changed. You're now completely talking about hypotheticals. I've said our position hasn't changed. It's been legislated. We support them. We have not changed our position.
Yes, in order to perform the most clown-like, silliest, craziest, stupidest, moronic backflip, months, if not years, of preparation are required, as we saw, to really prepare the crowds. And then, drum roll, here it came.
This is a change in position. I am not trying to argue that it is not a change of position.
Excellent stuff. Yes, Flip Flop the Clown couldn't have done a more effective backflip, Albozo. Months and months of telling us we will all be getting our tax cuts, then oops, no, many of you won't. According to the Australian newspaper, Peter Dutton has slammed Anthony Albanese's backflip on the legislated Stage 3 tax cuts and says his position as Prime Minister is now terminal. The opposition leader said Mr Albanese knowingly and willingly lied and called on him to apologise to you, the Australian people. Quote, "I don't think the Australian people will easily forget or forgive," said Peter Dutton, pointing out that over the course of the next 10 years, Albozo's backflip will actually increase the tax taken by the federal government by $28 billion because of bracket creep. Mr Dutton also said 4 million Australians would be adversely affected by the tax cut changes over the next few years. Even the Financial Review is describing Albo's tax flip as an almighty wedge. But will the coalition actually oppose this betrayal of the Australian people, or will the coalition allow it through? The Liberals' deputy leader, Susan Lee, looked like she was contemplating running away to join the circus when, again, according to the Australian, quote, Ms Lee backflipped on her Wednesday call to fight and roll back Labor's revamped Stage 3 tax cuts, instead saying the opposition would assess the new proposal. And where did this talented political gymnast perform this backflip? Why, under the ABC Big Top, of course. Quote, "I did not say we would roll back Labor's new proposal. I said we support the existing Stage 3 arrangement and we would assess the new proposal," Ms Lee told ABC Radio. My helpful tip to Susan Lee: remember why you guys won The Voice. Because you behaved like an opposition. And you opposed. You oppose on principle, and that principle is you say a very firm no to a Prime Minister who lies and who diddles one lot of fair dinkum Aussies in order to bribe another lot of Aussies. Nationals MP Michael McCormack, Barnaby Joyce, David Gillespie and Matt Canavan, as well as Liberal Senator Holly Hughes, have all called on the opposition leader to oppose the changes, warning it would be a major breach of voters' trust if the coalition did not carry through with the original Stage 3 tax cuts as promised. But anyone who says Al Bozo is just a one-trick pony doesn't know what else this particular Canberra clown had up his sleeve this week. Yes, an inquiry into prices at the supermarket. What a hoot. Quote, the Albanese government will instruct the competition watchdog, the ACCC, to scrutinise the supermarket industry amid accusations of price gouging. The supermarket industry will also be subject to a Greens-led parliamentary inquiry. What fun that will be. On top of which, just to complete the circus act, former Labor Competition Minister Dr. Craig Emerson is also examining the relationship between retailers and suppliers via a review of the Food and Grocery Code of Conduct. Here he is in full swing, auditioning outside the Canberra Big Top for the part.
No Whyalla wipe out there on my TV. No Whyalla wipe out there on my TV. No Whyalla wipe out there on my TV. Shocking me right out of my brain. Shocking me right out of my brain.
Ah, yes, Skyhook's karaoke, Craig Emerson's finest moment. Thanks, Craig, but I think we all preferred the original. But I digress. Lots of inquiries and commissions and panels and experts and no doubt new regulations and fiddling around with tax breaks, and all of that palaver is simply another magic disappearing act, sawing in half all our prosperity and future wealth whilst trying to distract us and get us to look the other way with glittering trinkets and gadgets, gizmos and multiple cost of living inquiries. Meanwhile, behind the scenes lurks this particular character, Chris Bowen, the climate change and energy clown. Sorry, climate change and energy minister, my mistake, and his madcap pursuit of net zero. The man who promised us repeatedly to bring down our power bills by $275. Instead, after encouraging the closing down of all our coal-fired power stations, massively subsidising unreliable and wasteful forms of so-called renewable energy, trying to push water uphill, the original Mr. Trumbull, the Harbourside Clown's brilliant circus act, crisscrossing our nation with massive transmission lines and planning to stick gigantic windmills all over our beautiful, pristine coastlines. Well, instead of going down, Chris Bowen has overseen energy prices in Australia go up and up and up and up to amongst the highest in the world. You've seen your bills, up and away they go. And what happens when energy goes up in price? So does everything else that's made with energy. All sorts of products, food, everyday goods, transportation, agriculture, distribution. Everything else goes up and up and up and up in price, which means inflation goes up, which means you have way, way less money when you go shopping. That's your supermarket inquiry for you. That is it, full stop. You can believe all these clownish circus acts and smoke and mirrors, sleights of hand, but in my opinion, the bottom line is this. Labor's net zero climate change policies will and are impoverishing this country, and you are paying through the nose for it. I wonder what Jerry Rafferty would say if he ever went to Canberra.
Clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right. Here I am, stuck in the middle with you. Yes, I'm stuck in the middle with you.
You're watching Outsiders and Lefty Lunacy, and Rita, it appears that there is a cure for lefty lunacy now. If we look at one particular character in America, what happened?
Well, what has happened to John Fetterman? He went into hospital and has come out almost a different man, a different politician, it appears like.
So he was a lefty loony when he went into hospital, and he comes out quite sensible.
Well, I mean, if this
he's still not dressing sensibly.
He's still not dressing sensibly, but he has been outspoken and for a man who seemed to be very muddled before, he seems to know what he's thinking and he's communicating very clearly. He had a bunch of protesters come to his house screaming all sorts of abuse, saying, Fetterman, you can't hide, you're supporting genocide. And let's see how he reacted to that.
Fetterman, you can't hide, you're supporting genocide. Fetterman, you can't hide, you're supporting genocide.
And there he was on his rooftop waving the Israeli flag. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't trying to appease them.
So let's be clear. So this John Fetterman was a Democrat, one of
Well, he's still a Democrat. He's a senator from Pennsylvania.
Yes.
Yeah.
He was a crazy lefty guy, but now he's very strong on support for Israel.
And a number of other issues as well, where he has said things that are at least centrist. They're certainly not far left. And you're thinking, wow, he's now become the sensible Democrat.
Fantastic.
So, you know, he put up in his office posters of all of the kidnapped hostages by Hamas, and he put them all up on his walls inside his office suite on Capitol Hill. He's been out doing things like saying, the United States shouldn't sell a massive steel plant to a foreign company because, you know, that would be bad for the American national security to lose this big steel plant to a foreign government. All sorts of things. He's really come around. If more Democrats were like this, you know, it'd be great.
But unfortunately, they're not. As we can see here, a bit of hyperbole for us from Karine Jean-Pierre, the press secretary of Joe Biden. Here she is again. She's got a bit of hyperbole for us.
The science is clear. Climate change is the existential threat of our time.
It's all in. The more she leans, you know, the more she's not telling the truth. Climate change, the greatest threat to all mankind. OK, that's her. Now, here in Australia, Rip Curl. Here we go, James. Go woke, go broke. What are these clowns doing?
Oh, well, I think let's just put this one up here on the screen. Here, there's the new is a celebrity endorsement that they've got here.
Ambassador.
It's celebrity ambassador Sasha Lowerson, who is a transgender, I guess, surfer.
A transgender woman surfer, in other words, a bloke who's competing in the girls' things.
And they got rid of Bethany Hamilton, who survived a shark biting off her arm. She still surfs, and because she was outspoken about protecting women's sport, it appears that she's been dumped. And this
let's get behind what's her name, Bethany.
Bethany Hamilton.
Let's get behind Bethany Hamilton. If you know her, give her a shout out for her brave stance. That's it for Outsiders. We'll see you next Sunday at 9 a.m. Have a good weekend.